The train screamed as it slowed. Steel wheels grinding against the rails, coughing smoke and cinders into the sky. Clara Whitfield pressed her gloved hands against her skirt to still the trembling. The gown was borrowed, patched at the hem, and too thin for the chill of a prairie spring. She clutched the small valise on her lap as though it might anchor her in a land that felt foreign already. When the train lurched to its final halt at the depot, the smell of coal smoke mixed with horse sweat, gun oil, and dust blew across her face. She rose, stepping into a new life with her heart pounding hard enough to echo in her ears. Men in broad hats clustered near the platform, spurs clinking as they shifted. Women in calico dresses held children's hands, their eyes sharp with curiosity. Clara caught whispers riding the wind. "Mail-order bride, that one," said a woman to her neighbor. "Look at the dress. Hand-me-down for sure." Another voice answered, "Still, maybe she's got gumption." Clara kept her chin high, though the sting of their judgment burned. She dreamed of this day since the letter came, a proposal written in a neat, blocky hand. Henry Dalton, a rancher of good standing. He had written that he needed a wife to keep house, to build a future with. Clara had read the words by candlelight in her cramped boarding-house room in St. Louis, her chest swelling with hope. She had lost her parents to illness, her prospects dwindled, her savings eaten away by years of small wages. The letter had been salvation. She'd written back with all the humility she could muster. "I may not have riches, but I have willing hands and a heart eager to serve." And now, here she was, stepping down from the train in a dress she'd mended 10 times, clutching all she owned in one small case. Henry Dalton was waiting at the far end of the platform. He was tall, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, his black coat crisp as if he'd just come from church. His eyes cold and narrow, swept over her as she approached. Clara forced a smile, heart thrumming. "Mr. Dalton?" He didn't return her smile. He looked her up and down, gaze lingering on the worn fabric of her dress, the scuffed toes of her shoes. His lip curled faintly. "You're Clara Whitfield?" "Yes, sir," she whispered, clasping her hands before her. "I came as you asked." His voice carried, sharp and unkind. "You didn't say you were like this." Heat rushed into her cheeks. "Like what?" "Poor," he said flatly. "Cheap dress. No dowry. You expect me to bring you onto my land, set you at my table, when you don't even look respectable?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara's stomach turned to stone. She wanted to sink into the boards beneath her feet, to vanish from the eyes that now burned holes into her back. "I can work," she stammered. "I'll keep the house clean, 10 stock if need be." He cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "You misled me. I wanted a woman who could improve my station, not drag it down. I won't have it." Whispers surged, crueler now. Clara's vision blurred. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking. "I came all this way." Henry's boots rang against the wood as he turned away. "You'll not be my wife," he said, loud enough for the depot to hear. "Find your own way." Her throat closed. She reached out instinctively, fingers trembling, but he strode off, never once looking back. The murmur of voices rose around her like a wave. Shameful. Left her standing right there. A girl ought to know her place. Children stared, women whispered, and men smirked at the spectacle. Clara stood frozen, her body rigid with humiliation, every beat of her heart hammering the words into her bones. Unwanted, unworthy, cast aside. The train whistled again and pulled away, leaving her on the platform with nowhere to go. Hours later, the depot had thinned. Lanterns glowed in the cool dusk, smoke from the cookstoves drifting into the air. Clara sat alone on a bench, hands numb around her valise. She had no money for a return ticket, no kin waiting anywhere in this endless country. Every footstep that passed seemed to carry another whisper, another sneer. As night thickened, danger grew. 2 cowhands stumbled from the saloon across the street, laughter slurred and mean. They spotted her abandoned, a woman alone in lace too thin for the wind. "Well, looky here," one drawled, swaying. "A bride with no groom." The other grinned, missing 2 teeth. "Reckon she could use some company." They came closer, boots dragging, eyes hungry. Clara rose, heart slamming against her ribs. She clutched her case like a shield. "Stay back," she warned, though her voice shook. The taller man laughed, the sound oily. "Ain't nobody here claiming you. Maybe we will." He reached for her arm. Clara jerked away, her valise slipping from her hand and thudding against the dirt. Panic surged, her breath short, her mind screaming for escape. Then came another voice. Low, firm, the kind that left no room for jest. "That's far enough." The cowhands turned. A man stood a few yards away, hat pulled low, rifle cradled easy in his hands. He wasn't flashy, not dressed like the gamblers who swaggered through town, but something about him stilled the night. He was tall, broad, with shoulders carved from years of ranch work, his shirt rolled to the elbow, hands steady as iron. His eyes, when a lantern caught them, were pale, calm, and dangerous. The taller cowhand spat. "We ain't mayonnaise no trouble, McGraw." "Then move along," the man said. His voice was like gravel, slow and steady. "The lady don't want your company." The cowhands hesitated, glanced at each other, then muttered curses and stumbled away into the dark. Silence fell, save for Clara's ragged breaths. She bent quickly, snatching up her valise. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it again. The stranger stepped closer, lowering the rifle. "You all right, miss?" Clara swallowed hard, nodding, though her throat was too tight for words. He tipped his hat. "Name's Daniel McGraw. Got a ranch a few miles west. You looking for a place to stay?" Her eyes stung with unshed tears. I don't want charity." His gaze held hers, steady, unpitying. "Ain't charity. Just a roof and a meal till you figure your way. You shouldn't be out here alone." Her pride wrestled with her desperation. She wanted to refuse, to prove she could stand on her own. But the chill of the night cut through her thin dress, and the memory of Henry's rejection burned in her chest. She nodded faintly. "Just for a little while." He reached for her case, lifting it with ease. "Just for a little while," he echoed. Together they walked into the night. The prairie stretched wide and endless beyond the depot, the moon silvering the grass, coyotes howling in the far distance. Clara kept her face turned from him, afraid he'd see her tears, afraid of the silence between them. Yet something in his quiet presence steadied her. As the horse carried them west, Clara thought of the eyes at the depot, of Henry's cold dismissal, of the laughter that had gutted her. She thought she had lost everything in that moment, and perhaps she had. But when she glanced at the man beside her, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat, she felt the faintest flicker of something else. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of it. The prairie wind lifted her veil and carried it away into the night. She did not chase it. For the first time since she stepped from the train, she let go. And in that letting go, the faintest seed of something new was planted. The depot was behind her. Ahead lay a ranch and a man she did not yet understand. But the world had already shifted. The life she thought was lost had only been a doorway to something else, though she could not see its shape yet. Some rejections cut deeper than bullets. But sometimes the cruelest endings are only the beginnings of better stories. The first light of dawn spilled across the prairie like a river of gold, and Clara woke to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. She blinked against the brightness, realizing she was lying in a bed softer than any she had known in years. The quilt smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, and through the thin walls of the small ranch house came the rhythmic sound of boots on wood. For a moment, confusion held her. Then memory returned. Henry Dalton's rejection, the jeers at the depot, the cowhands closing in, and Daniel McGraw stepping between her and ruin. She sat up quickly, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress, though nothing could hide the wear in the fabric. Her valise sat at the foot of the bed, the only evidence that she belonged here. Her heart fluttered with unease. She was a guest, perhaps even a burden, in a stranger's home. The door creaked, and Daniel's voice came through, steady as ever. "Coffee's hot, if you want it. Day's work don't wait." Clara hesitated before stepping into the kitchen. Daniel stood near the stove, his broad back to her, lifting a blackened pot with one hand and pouring steaming liquid into tin mugs. His shirt was already dusted with flour and sweat, his sleeves rolled up, his forearms marked by old scars and sun. He slid one mug across the table toward her without a word. She wrapped her hands around it, savoring the heat. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the stove and the steady tick of a clock on the wall. "I'll earn my keep," she said at last, her voice firmer than she felt. Daniel glanced at her, his pale eyes sharp, though not unkind. "Didn't say you wouldn't. Reckon there's plenty to do if you're willin' to—" She lifted her chin. "I am." That morning marked the beginning of a rhythm Clara had never known. The work was hard, the kind that left her bones aching and her hands blistered, but it was honest, and she clung to it as though proving herself might wash away the humiliation of the depot. She learned to saddle a horse under Daniel's patient guidance, though her first attempt ended with her face in the dirt and his rare, quiet chuckle breaking the silence. She helped mend fences, her skirts catching on the wire until he handed her an old pair of trousers that had once belonged to his late wife. Clara had blushed but taken them, her dignity no match for the work at hand. Each evening, when the sun sank and the cattle settled, they shared meals at the rough-hewn table. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. She began to notice the way he listened more than he talked, the way his eyes softened when he caught her struggling but didn't step in unless she truly needed him. Still, shadows lingered. Every trip into town reminded her that she was an outsider, a spectacle. Whispers followed her steps down the boardwalk, and the church women watched her with a mixture of pity and scorn. "That's the bride Dalton sent away," one would murmur. "Already set up at McGraw's place, you see?" The words cut, though Clara kept her back straight and her gaze steady. But at night, in the quiet of her room, the shame returned, heavy as stone. The tension reached its peak one market day when she and Daniel rode into town together. She carried a basket of eggs, careful not to break a one, when Henry Dalton himself appeared outside the mercantile. His coat was sharp, his boots polished, but his eyes were bitter, cold as river ice. "Well, ain't this a sight?" he drawled, his voice loud enough for all nearby to hear. "The poor little bride didn't waste time, did she? Left me and landed herself a rancher." Clara's grip on the basket tightened until the wicker creaked. "You left me, Mr. Dalton," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Right there at the depot." Laughter rippled from the bystanders. Henry's face darkened. He stepped closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "You were never fit to be a Dalton. And you'll ruin McGraw, too. Mark my words." Daniel's shadow fell across them both. He didn't raise his voice, but the steel in it silenced the street. "That's enough." Henry sneered. "You think you can steal what I ordered, McGraw? You'll regret it." The threat hung in the air long after Henry stalked away. Clara's heart pounded, not from fear of him alone, but from the guilt pressing down on her shoulders. Trouble had followed her here. She wondered, as they rode home in silence, if Daniel regretted stepping in that night at the depot. The days that followed proved Henry's words were not idle. Fences were cut in the night, leaving cattle scattered. A water trough was fouled with kerosene, poisoning the livestock. Daniel worked harder, jaw tight, eyes shadowed with worry, though he spoke little of it. Clara tried to match his strength, rising earlier, laboring longer, as though her efforts might somehow shoulder the weight he carried. One evening, after a long day of repairing a gate Henry's men had broken, Clara stood with Daniel near the corral. The sky was painted with streaks of red and gold, the air sharp with the promise of rain. She stared at the ground, twisting her hands. "You should have let me go," she whispered. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Why would I do that?" "Because I've brought nothing but trouble," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I was unwanted before, and now, I've only made you a target." Silence stretched between them. At last, Daniel set down the rope he'd been holding and faced her fully. His gaze was steady, unflinching. "You were never unwanted, just unrecognized." The words struck something deep within her, loosening the knot she'd carried since the depot. She looked away, blinking hard, unable to speak. That night, as rain began to fall, she lay awake, listening to the storm hammer the roof. For the first time in weeks, she felt warmth, not just from the fire, but from the quiet strength of the man who had given her shelter. She did not know what lay ahead, but she knew she would not run. In the morning, they found hoof prints near the barn and smoke on the horizon where someone had set fire to a distant patch of grass. Clara's heart raced, but Daniel's jaw only tightened. "It's Dalton," he said simply. "He means to drive me out." Clara stood beside him, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. "Then he'll have to fight both of us." Daniel looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes before giving way to something else, something steadier, deeper. For the first time, a true smile touched his lips, faint but certain. And in that moment, Clara knew she had crossed a threshold. No longer the rejected bride at the depot, no longer the woman cowering under whispers. She was part of this fight, this land, this home. The storm had only begun, but she would not turn away. Some battles were fought with bullets and fire. Others were fought in the heart, against the voices that said you did not belong. And Clara Whitfield, for the first time in her life, chose to fight. ChatGPT said, "The night smelled of smoke before Clara's eyes opened. At first she thought it was the fire in the stove, a log burning down to embers. But then the sharp crackle came, followed by the unmistakable roar of something larger. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and the glow of orange light flickered through the thin curtains of her room. "Daniel!" she cried, already scrambling to her feet. His boots struck the floorboards outside her door at the same moment, his voice hard and urgent. "Barn's on fire." Clara snatched her shawl and rushed into the yard, the breath torn from her lungs by the sight. Flames licked skyward from the barn roof, sparks raining down onto the dry grass. The cattle bawled in panic from their pen, shadows shifting violently in the glow. Daniel was already hauling a bucket from the trough, his face grim, his shirt flaring with light from the inferno. She didn't hesitate. She ran to the well, seized the second bucket, and began the brutal rhythm of hauling water. The heat singed her skin, smoke clawing at her throat, but she worked beside him without pause, dashing water onto the flames. Gunfire split the night. The shot whined past her ear and struck the fence post with a vicious crack. Clara froze, eyes wide. Figures emerged from the darkness beyond the corral, rifles in hand, faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. Henry Dalton's voice carried over the chaos, sharp as a whip. "That's far enough, McGraw. Should have known better than to steal what's mine." Daniel didn't stop moving, didn't even flinch at the bullet. He shoved another bucket into Clara's hands. "Keep throwing," he said, calm but firm. Then, louder, his words aimed at the dark beyond the fence. "She was never yours, Dalton. Not then. Not ever." The barn groaned as part of the roof caved inward, flames shooting higher. Clara's eyes watered with heat and terror, but still she ran, splashing water where she could, knowing it was hopeless to save the structure, but unwilling to surrender without a fight. Another shot rang out. Daniel swung his rifle up in one fluid motion, returning fire. The night exploded with the staccato thunder of gunshots, muzzle flashes tearing through the dark. Clara dropped behind the trough, heart hammering, clutching the empty bucket like it might shield her. "Stay low," Daniel shouted, his voice barely audible above the roar of the flames and the gunfire. The attackers moved closer, shadows darting between the cottonwoods. Clara's fear turned to fury. She thought of the depot, of Henry's sneer, of the laughter that had followed her like a curse. No more. Not tonight. Her hands shook, but she crawled to the porch where Daniel had left a revolver. She had never fired one, but her father's lessons from long ago echoed faintly in her memory. Thumb back the hammer. Squeeze, don't jerk. She crouched, revolver heavy in her hands, breath ragged as she watched the attackers circle. Henry himself stepped into the firelight, his face twisted with rage, his coat thrown back to reveal a pistol at his hip. "You'll regret crossing me, McGraw. You and your straggling charity case both." Daniel fired again, the bullet kicking dust near Henry's boots. "Go home, Dalton. You're finished here." But Henry only laughed, cruel and sharp. Finished? You've just begun to bleed. He raised his pistol. Clara didn't think. She stood, hands steady despite the fear screaming inside her, and aimed. The revolver bucked in her grip, the sound splitting her ears. The shot struck the dirt just at Henry's feet, close enough that he stumbled back with a snarl. His men faltered, glancing toward her in surprise. Daniel seized the moment. He fired again, dropping one man to the ground. The others broke, retreating into the night with curses and shouts. But Henry remained, teeth bared, eyes locked on Clara. "You'll pay for that," he hissed, advancing. Daniel stepped between them, rifle raised, his body a shield. "No, Dalton. This ends now." The two men faced each other in the firelight, the barn collapsing in on itself with a roar behind them. Clara could barely breathe. She gripped the revolver, ready though her hands ached from the recoil. Henry sneered. "She was nothing until I made her something." Daniel's voice was quiet, deadly. "She was everything long before you ever laid eyes on her." They fired almost at the same instant. Henry's shot grazed Daniel's arm, spinning him back. Daniel's bullet tore across Henry's shoulder, sending the man crashing to the dirt with a howl. His pistol clattered away into the grass. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the hiss of dying flames. Henry writhed, clutching his shoulder, curses spilling from his lips. His men were gone, leaving him alone in the dirt. Clara rushed to Daniel's side, her hands trembling as she pressed against the wound in his arm. Blood seeped hot between her fingers, but he caught her gaze and shook his head faintly. "It's not deep. I'm fine." The sound of horses thundered in the distance. Lanterns bobbed as the sheriff and a handful of townsmen rode into the yard, guns drawn. They took in the scene quickly, Henry on the ground, Daniel wounded, the barn in ruins. The sheriff dismounted, his face hard. "Dalton," he said coldly, "you've overstepped for the last time." Henry spat blood and rage, but he was hauled to his feet and bound. As they dragged him away, his eyes burned with hatred, fixed on Clara. She held his gaze without flinching. For the first time, she did not look away. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoldering ruin. The air reeked of wet ash, the ground littered with blackened beams. Daniel stood with his arm in a makeshift bandage, watching the smoke drift into the pale morning sky. Clara stood beside him, her hair tangled, her face streaked with soot, exhaustion pulling at every bone. Yet she felt more alive than she had since stepping off that train. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "All of this because of me." Daniel turned to her, his expression steady despite the weariness in his eyes. "Don't ever say that. You didn't bring this. Dalton did. And together we sent him off." Her breath caught. "Together," she echoed. For a long moment they stood in silence, the prairie stretching endless and quiet around them, the ruin of the barn behind. Then Daniel spoke, his voice low but certain. "Clara, I don't want you to leave. Not now. Not ever." Tears pricked her eyes, but she smiled through them. "I thought I came here for a husband. Instead, I found a partner." He reached for her hand, calloused fingers wrapping around hers with quiet strength. "That's all I've ever wanted." The wind shifted, carrying away the last of the smoke, and Clara felt as though something inside her had been carried with it, the weight of rejection, the sting of shame. What remained was fire, not of destruction, but of resolve. She was no longer the girl abandoned at the depot, humiliated before strangers. She was a woman who had stood, who had fought, who had chosen her place. The prairie sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows of night. Some promises broke, loud in front of crowds. Others were made in the silence, after fire, when two people realized they'd rather face the ashes together than stand alone. The days that followed the fire were thick with ash and silence. Clara woke each morning to the smell of smoke still clinging to her dress, the charred ruin of the barn staring like an empty socket against the rising sun. Daniel worked with quiet determination, rebuilding fences, tending cattle, keeping his wounded arm bound tight. But Clara could see the weight pressing him down, not just the loss of timber and stock, but the memory of Henry Dalton's sneer, the promise of revenge etched into his bloody smile. Clara threw herself into the work beside him, her hands blistered and hardened, her shoulders aching from lifting, hauling, mending. She cooked, scrubbed, gathered eggs, and learned to ride the range with him when he needed a second pair of eyes on the cattle. But even as she worked, she felt the fear gnawing that Henry wasn't finished, that he'd slither back when the law's attention turned elsewhere. One evening, as the prairie sky burned crimson, Clara found Daniel sitting on the porch, hat tilted low, his good hand absently polishing his rifle. She sat beside him, brushing dirt from her skirt. "You think he'll come back?" she said quietly. Daniel's jaw worked, but he didn't look at her. "Men like Dalton don't quit. Sheriff's got him locked up now, but it won't last. He's got money, friends. A cell won't hold him forever." Clara clasped her hands in her lap, willing herself not to tremble. "Then we'll be ready." His gaze flicked to her, sharp with surprise, then softened. "You've got more steel in you than you know, Clara." She wanted to believe it, but at night she dreamed of flames, of Henry's eyes burning through smoke, of laughter at the depot. She woke, gasping, Daniel's quiet, breathing steady beside her, grounding her when the terror tried to steal her courage. By the second week, word came by way of a ranch hand riding fast from town. Henry Dalton had escaped custody, killed a deputy, stole a horse, vanished into the breaks. The sheriff's men searched, but the prairie was wide, the gullies endless, and vengeance had a way of waiting. Daniel's jaw tightened when the news reached him. He gathered ammunition, checked every lock, walked the fence line twice each day. Clara followed him with her heart hammering, fear sharp as glass under her skin. Yet beneath it ran a current of resolve. She would not run. She would not be the woman left behind, cowering in the shadows. The attack came 3 nights later. The moon was a thin silver hook in the sky when the dogs began to bark. Daniel was already at the door, rifle in hand, when the first shot shattered the quiet. A lantern on the porch burst into shards, fire spilling across the boards. "Down!" Daniel barked, shoving Clara behind the table. Bullets tore through the walls, with splintering glass shattering. Smoke filled the room. Clara crawled low, heart thundering, ears ringing from the gunfire. She reached for the revolver they kept in the cupboard, her hands steady now with the practice Daniel had given her. She met his eyes in the flickering dark. He gave a single nod. The shouts outside carried Henry's voice, drunk on rage. "McGraw, you thought you could shame me? Thought you could take what's mine?" His laughter was wild, broken. "I'll burn you out, and I'll drag her back myself." Clara's blood turned to ice, but fury rose hot to meet it. She remembered his hand reaching for her at the depot, his voice dripping scorn, the humiliation that had gutted her. "No more." Daniel kicked the back door open, drawing fire as he returned shots into the dark. Clara followed low, circling toward the barn ruins where the smoke from old timbers still lingered. Shadows moved against the prairie grass. 6 men, rifles flashing. Henry stood among them, his arms still bandaged, his face twisted in the firelight. Daniel's rifle cracked, one man falling with a scream. Clara fired 2, her bullet striking sparks from a rock near another's feet, sending him stumbling back. The fight was chaos, fire shouting, bullets tearing the night. Then Henry charged. He came straight for Clara, his pistol raised, teeth bared. "You're mine," he roared, the madness in his eyes bright as the flames that had once devoured the barn. Time slowed. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger, but the hammer jammed, the revolver clicking useless in her hand. Her breath caught, too slow, too late. Daniel was there in an instant, slamming into Henry with the weight of a bull. The 2 men crashed into the dirt, grappling, fists and fury flying. Daniel's rifle was lost in the struggle, Henry's pistol knocked away. They rolled, grunting, striking, blood flashing in the moonlight. Clara's heart screamed. She dropped the revolver, searching the ground with frantic eyes until her hand closed on a broken board blackened from the fire. She seized it and surged forward just as Henry forced Daniel onto his back, hands closing around his throat. Die with her name in your mouth, Henry snarled, pressing down. Clara swung with all the strength she had. The board cracked across Henry's shoulder, sending him sprawling with a howl. Daniel gasped for air, rolling free. Clara raised the board again, ready to strike, her arms trembling with rage. Henry staggered to his feet, blood streaking his face, eyes wild. For a moment, he looked less like a man and more like something broken, consumed by hate. He lunged for her again, and Daniel's rifle roared. The shot struck Henry square in the chest. He froze, shock flickering across his face. Then he crumpled into the dirt, the night going suddenly still around them. Clara dropped the board, her body shaking, breath tearing in and out. Daniel stood slowly, rifle smoking, his chest heaving. For a long moment, they stared down at Henry's lifeless form, the silence of the prairie closing in like a shroud. When the sheriff and his men arrived at dawn, they found the yard littered with spent shells, blood staining the grass, the body of Henry Dalton cooling in the dirt. They asked questions, but the truth was plain. The man had come for vengeance and found his end instead. The lawmen rode off with the bodies of Henry's fallen, the sun rising bright and merciless over the plains. Daniel sat on the porch steps, bandaging his scraped knuckles, while Clara brought water to wash the blood from his skin. Her hands shook, but not from fear. He caught her wrist, his grip firm, his eyes searching hers. "You saved me." Her throat tightened. "We saved each other." The words hung between them, truer than any vow. She thought of the depot, of the humiliation that had nearly broken her, of the fire that had threatened to consume her, of the man now sitting before her steady and strong. She had come west seeking a husband, a place, a future. What she had found was something deeper, a partner, a home built not of walls but of fire shared and survived. Daniel drew her close, his forehead resting against hers, the weight of the night easing in the warmth of her presence. "You're not leaving," he said softly, as if it were fact, not question. Clara's tears slipped free, but her smile held steady. "Never." The prairie stretched endless before them, the wind carrying away the last echoes of gunfire. Somewhere a meadowlark sang, its call rising clear above the hush. Clara closed her eyes and breathed it in. She had walked into the arms of a better man, yes, but she had also found the better woman inside herself. And as the sun climbed higher, she knew the West would test them again, in fire, in drought, in storm. But they would meet it side by side, unbroken, because some stories didn't end at the depot, or in flames, or in blood. They began there, and theirs was only just beginning.